WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Visit Bloomington. With over 350 restaurants to choose from, Bloomington, Indiana is truly a food lover's paradise. Go to visitbloomington.com to discover what suits your taste.
This is WFYI News Now. It's February 2nd, and I'm Darian Benson. On today's show, a bill at the State House that would allow school boards to approve or deny classroom materials about human sexuality. New research on using psilocybin to treat mental health issues, substance use disorders, and chronic pain. And last week, federal prosecutors arrested the former heads of 2 virtual schools as part of a $44 million fraud case. We've got a conversation from our education desk to find out how we got here.
And it also had very questionable academics, but no one was paying attention to it until 2017. And I actually just looked up an old article that said that it had a 100% attendance rate, which we now know is not true.
Those stories coming up. First, the Indiana Supreme Court yesterday made public a confidential agreement entered into by Attorney General Todd Rokita when he was publicly reprimanded by the court last year. The discipline stemmed from comments made by the Attorney General about Dr. Caitlin Bernard after she publicly discussed providing abortion care to a 10-year-old Ohio rape victim. The State Attorney Disciplinary Commission asked the court to unseal the confidential agreement because it argued Rokita's statement issued after the public reprimand called into question his sincerity. In its decision to unseal the agreement, the Supreme Court noted that Rokita did not object to making it public, and it says there is no sensitive information being released. Confidential agreement does not appear to contain any information that wasn't already public. In a statement, Rokita maintains that he never contradicted the agreement. And a Senate committee approved a bill on Wednesday that would give school boards the authority to approve or deny curricular materials concerning human sexuality. Kirsten Adair reports opponents of the bill say it would be difficult to implement and cause a chilling effect for the LGBTQ+ community.
The bill requires schools to publish classroom materials and lesson plans related to human sexuality online and notify parents when the lessons will occur. The lessons must also be approved by the school board. Parents in Indiana can already opt their children out of classroom instruction on human sexuality. Senator Gary Byrne, one of the bill's authors, says this bill goes further toward informing parents about their children's education. Critics of the bill, like Gender Nexus Executive Director Emma Vosky, say human sexuality is too loosely defined.
The term is so ambiguous that even the bill's sponsor couldn't answer if the term human sexuality included banning And Tango Makes Three, a book about 2 dude penguins raising a chick.
Despite opposition, the bill passed the Senate Education and Career Development Committee 8-5. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Kirsten Adair.
Researchers have been looking at using psilocybin, a chemical compound found in some psychedelic mushrooms, as a treatment for mental health issues, substance use disorders, and chronic pain. Abigail Ruman reports a Senate committee passed a bill yesterday that would make it easier for that research to take place in Indiana.
The bill establishes a fund to give research institutions financial support to study how psilocybin can treat mental health or other medical conditions, but does not legalize the use outside of clinical studies. Dr. David Diaz works at IU Health as a psychiatrist. He says when traditional treatments don't work, patients will tell him that they have no sense of hope.
This bill, I think, will at least give people a sense of hope, even if they don't qualify for a study, even if the studies aren't even done, that at least it's being looked at.
The bill also requires that research institutions that conduct a clinical study have to report the findings to an interim study committee, the Indiana Department of Health, and the Indiana Division of Mental Health and Addiction. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
The bill passed the Senate Appropriations Committee and now goes to the full Senate for consideration. And for our final story today, last week federal prosecutors arrested the former heads of 2 virtual schools. They're accused of defrauding the state of Indiana of more than $44 million by faking student enrollments. Dylan Pierce McCoy sat down with education editor Eric Weddle to ask him about the scandal that's been unfolding for years.
These allegations haven't been proven, but the fraud that prosecutors are alleging is enormous. Prosecutors say that between 2016 and 2018, the schools reported more than 4,500 students as enrolled when they weren't actually attending school. And if they're convicted, the people who are facing charges could go to prison for decades. Can you take us back to the beginning? How did this start?
Yeah, well, I think go back and look at, Indiana's first virtual school, it opened in 2009. and it was called Hoosier Virtual Academy. And at the time, there was just a lot of hope that like virtual schools were going to help non-traditional students get an education. And it attracted thousands of students across the state, but that school's academic outcomes were really bad, and the state sanctioned it, and then it actually closed down. And during this whole time, Indiana Virtual School was operating. It opened in 2011, and it also had very questionable academics, but no one was paying attention to it until 2017. And I actually just looked up an old article that said that it had 100% attendance rate, which we now know is not true.
So I first heard about Indiana Virtual School back in 2017, and at the time I was a reporter with Chalkbeat. And my coworker, Shayna Cavazos, investigated the school. She spent months on this investigation. And like you said, we sort of, on its face, the academic results at this school were terrible. But what Shayna found was a couple of other indicators that were just really concerning. It only had one teacher for every 222 students. And it only spent about 10% of its budget on instruction. I mean, what was going on there really indicated that the school was troubled. Mm-hmm. But Indiana Virtual did stay open. And in fact, the school district that oversaw it let the leaders open another sister school.
Right. And I think we should probably explain that, Indiana Virtual School was a charter school. And that means it's publicly funded and privately managed by a nonprofit board. And all charter schools, they have to be authorized by someone, an entity that oversees them to operate. And IVS was authorized by the small public school district called Daleville Community Schools. And IVS was their only charter. And Daleville finally initiates an investigation into the school after the Chalkbeat article comes out, and they make plans to basically close the school down because they knew something was wrong, and they were saying that. And I was at a meeting in Daleville in the summer of 2019 when this process was ongoing, and this IVS attorney actually claimed that not only was nothing inappropriate happening, there's no fraud, but that the school was owed more money from the state of Indiana. But then a week later, I went to a meeting of the Indiana Virtual Schools Board, and before it began, the members resigned. And before that meeting was supposed to begin, they also realized that their offices were locked and nobody could get in.
So did they have the meeting in the hall?
The meeting was going to be held like in the foyer of the building. And then once everyone resigned, they ended it and they walked out.
The State Board of Accounts puts out a report in 2020, and this lists some of this inflated enrollment we've talked about. It also says that the schools are sending millions of dollars to related companies with ties to school officials. And that leads to a lawsuit from the Attorney General that's seeking over $150 million from the schools and people tied to them. And that lawsuit is still ongoing. I think at this point, the suspense is around whether we'll ever get any of this public money back.
Yeah, and that's a question, some lawmakers and some have been asking for the past few years now. And I think we're all going to still wait for that answer. And this will probably be a case that we're going to follow, for the next few years. So thanks for talking, Dylan.
Yeah, I'll keep following with you. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Aubriana Heron, Drew Dodlin, Kendall Antron, who composed the music for this podcast, and me, Darian Benson. Our news director is Sarah Neal Estes. If you liked today's episode, remember to subscribe and share. And follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back Monday.